In the late 1930s, as storm clouds gathered over Europe, engineers at the Douglas Aircraft Company in California were sketching something strange, a bomber that didn't look like a bomber. It was small, sleek, and fast, with a short fuselage and twin engines mounted close to the body, like the shoulders of a sprinter tensed before the gunshot. It was built not to lumber through the sky in formation, but to dart, dive, and strike with precision. When the prototype, designated DB-7, first rolled out of the Douglas plant in 1938, it looked more like a twin-engined fighter than a bomber. Its cockpit sat high above a glass nose that gleamed under the sun, giving pilots an almost panoramic view. Beneath that nose, two Wright R-2600 twin Cyclone engines purred with a deep, confident hum. The engineers were proud. They'd built something fast enough to outrun most fighters, strong enough to carry a bomb load heavier than its size suggested, and nimble enough to dance through anti-aircraft fire. But when they brought it to the United States Army Air Corps, the officers frowned. America wasn't at war. The Air Corps doctrine of 1938 believed in big bombers and long ranges, aircraft that could cross oceans, not sprint across battlefields. Heavyweights like the B-17 Flying Fortress drew all the attention. The DB-7, small and short-legged, didn't fit the vision. One general, after a demonstration flight, reportedly shrugged. It's a fine airplane for someone else's war. And someone else was already waiting. Across the Atlantic, France was bracing for impact. The shadow of Nazi Germany stretched over Europe, and French commanders needed aircraft fast enough to survive the Luftwaffe's modern fighters, strong enough to hit back at armored spearheads. They looked to America, and Douglas's little twin-engine experiment caught their eye. In January 1939, the French government ordered 100 DB-7s, the first major American combat aircraft export in history. The French called it the Douglas Boston. Overnight, the rejected American prototype became Europe's new hope. At the Douglas factory, production lines sprang to life. Men and women worked in 3 shifts, riveting aluminum skins under floodlights. The air was thick with the smell of oil and the metallic whine of drills. Engineers made small changes for French specifications, metric instruments, different bomb racks, French radios, but the heart of the aircraft remained the same: speed. By the time the first DB-7s reached Europe in early 1940, the war had already exploded. The Germans had invaded France and the Low Countries. The new planes went straight into the fire. At Villers-Coublay Airfield, French pilots uncrated their new American machines with the awe of men meeting something foreign and alive. They found an aircraft that accelerated like a fighter, rolled tightly, and climbed with authority. It could dive at over 300 miles per hour and pull out clean. On their first sorties against advancing German columns, the DB-7s tore through convoys with pinpoint bombing runs. A French pilot, Captain René Lafont, wrote home, "She is not a bomber, she is a hawk. You point her nose down and she falls upon the enemy like a blade." For a brief moment, the little Douglas bomber earned a reputation as one of the best attack aircraft in the sky. But France could not be saved by a handful of planes. By June 1940, the country had fallen. Dozens of DB-7s burned on airfields. Others escaped south or were seized by the Vichy regime. The order for new aircraft hung in limbo. And then came Britain. After France's collapse, the Royal Air Force stepped in and adopted the surviving aircraft, renaming them Boston for daylight operations and Havoc for night fighting versions. The British liked what they saw. The A-20's speed made it ideal for hit-and-run raids over the Channel,
and its short takeoff distance suited small airfields across southern England. RAF test pilot Geoffrey Tyson recorded in his logbook, "Handles like a fighter, lands like a lady. It's the first bomber that feels like it wants to live." At night, modified Havocs carried radar and strange experimental weapons. Some even flew without bombs, used instead as intruders, slipping over German bases to strafe aircraft as they took off. Others dropped flares to mark targets for heavy bombers. The versatility was astounding. What had begun as a commercial orphan, a design without a home, was finding its purpose in the hands of desperate men. Meanwhile, back in the United States, the Army Air Corps began to take notice. Reports from the RAF were glowing. The Boston was fast, durable, and easy to maintain. In a world now at war, America could no longer dismiss speed. When the U.S. entered the conflict after Pearl Harbor, the DB-7 was reborn as the A-20 Havoc. It was the same design, now refined. Self-sealing fuel tanks, armor plating for the pilot, better guns in the nose, and stronger engines. The Air Corps finally realized that in the new kind of war, the war of blitzkrieg, convoys, and low-altitude strikes, small, fast, and agile might matter more than massive and slow. Production ramped up overnight. In Long Beach and El Segundo, rows of A-20s gleamed silver under hangar lights, their twin props spinning for test runs. Ground crews stenciled U.S. Army Air Forces across the wings, and pilots, most barely out of flight school, learned to tame the hot little bomber that could climb like a fighter and dive like lightning. At a briefing in 1942, a squadron commander summed it up with a grin. "Gentlemen, she's small, she's fast, and if you handle her right, she'll make the enemy very, very sorry." When the first American A-20 squadrons deployed to North Africa later that year, German intelligence barely took notice. They classified it as a leichter Bomber, a light bomber of little importance. Luftwaffe pilots joked that it looked like a fat dragonfly, an easy target for their Messerschmitt Bf-109s. They had no idea what was coming, because the little bomber that no one had asked for was about to make the Luftwaffe learn a painful new truth. Speed is a weapon, and the tiny American bomber would soon be outrunning their pride of the sky. The North African sun was white and merciless, a glare that turned steel into fire and sand into glass. It was here, under that brutal light, that the A-20 Havoc would earn its name. When the first squadrons of the 47th Bomb Group arrived in Algeria in late 1942, the airmen were nervous and untested. They had trained on new aircraft that seemed more like overgrown fighters than bombers. The A-20 was small, quick, and temperamental. A devil with wings, one mechanic called it. It carried just 4 500-pound bombs and 2 machine guns in the nose. On paper, it was no match for the Luftwaffe's speed and experience. The German pilots who faced them certainly thought so. From their bases in Tunisia, Luftwaffe squadrons, Jagdgeschwader 27 and 53, had ruled the desert skies for months. Their Messerschmitt Df-109Fs could climb faster, dive steeper, and fight longer than anything the Allies had fielded there. When they saw the stubby American bombers arriving, they sneered. One German officer supposedly quipped, "We'll swat them down like flies." The first engagements would make him swallow those words. On the morning of December 6, 1942, 6 A-20s lifted off from an airstrip near Bone, Algeria. Their target, a German fuel depot outside Gabus. The pilots flew low, barely 50 feet above the desert floor, dust curling behind their wings. The A-20's engines roared like twin furnaces, Pratt & Whitney R2600s, each pushing out 1,600 horsepower. At 280 miles per hour, they skimmed over ridges, hugging the terrain, invisible to radar. Then, as they approached the target, they climbed sharply and broke formation. Bombs fell in perfect rhythm, a deadly percussion across the enemy depot. The explosions rippled through the desert. The German anti-aircraft crews barely had time to react. The A-20s banked, dove, and vanished as fast as they had appeared. Moments later, a flight of Bf-109s from JG-27 scrambled to intercept. They caught sight of the departing bombers against the rising sun and gave chase. But something strange happened. The distance between hunter and prey didn't close. It widened. The A-20s, loaded with fuel and now lighter without bombs, were accelerating, 310, 320, 330 miles per hour. The Messerschmitts struggled to keep up. Their advantage in climb rate meant little in a level chase, and the A-20's clean aerodynamics and power gave it the speed of a medium fighter. The German pilots stared in disbelief as the slow bombers disappeared into the haze. One of them later wrote in a report, "The Americans' twin-engine bombers are faster than our fighters at low altitude. Impossible, but true." From that day on, the Luftwaffe learned to respect the Havoc. It wasn't just fast, it was unpredictable. The A-20 could fly under radar, drop its bombs, then climb out of reach before enemy fighters even arrived. It could strike supply convoys, gun positions, or airfields, and be gone before the defenders knew what had hit them. Its low-level speed and maneuverability made it a ghost in daylight. Crews began to fly in pairs or triplets, attacking with terrifying precision. One pilot would dive on the target while another strafed the perimeter with nose-mounted 50 caliber guns. Trucks, tanks, even half-tracks exploded under the bursts. Rommel's logistics lines, the arteries of the Afrika Korps, began to bleed. To the Germans, the A-20 earned its nickname the hard way, Havoc. American crews, meanwhile, fell in love with their strange little bomber. It was fast, forgiving, and tough. It could take damage that would kill other planes, holes in the fuselage, oil leaking from engines, even shredded control surfaces, and still fly home. Captain Edward Rusty Chappell, one of the first A-20 pilots in the Mediterranean, described it perfectly. She was like a wild Mustang. If you respected her, she'd carry you anywhere. If you didn't, she'd kill you quick. The Havoc had quirks, though. Its short wings made landings tricky. Its cockpit was cramped, and the gunner sat low, half blind to what was happening behind. But pilots forgave all of it because of what the plane gave in return: speed and control. When the Luftwaffe learned to fear it, so did the ground troops. The A-20's low attack runs were so fast that German soldiers nicknamed it Der Pfeil des Todes, the arrow of death. As the Battle of Kasserine Pass raged in early 1943, the A-20 proved decisive. American troops were reeling under Rommel's counterattack. Roads were choked with retreating vehicles and wounded men. Then, at noon, the sky filled with the growl of twin engines. A flight of A-20s roared over the ridges and dropped their bombs directly on advancing panzer columns. Tanks erupted in fire. Trucks exploded. The shockwave threw dust high into the sky. The A-20s didn't circle or linger. They simply struck and vanished. A British war correspondent watching from a nearby ridge wrote, "They came like thunder and were gone like ghosts. I have never seen a bomber move like that." By the summer of 1943, the A-20 was everywhere in North Africa. It flew from Tunisia to Sicily, from Benghazi to Tripoli. The Luftwaffe, stretched thin and reeling from losses, no longer mocked it. One German mechanic, interrogated after capture, admitted, "At first we thought it was a toy. Now when we hear those engines, we run for cover." For the men who flew it, the A-20 had become more than a machine. It was a statement, a declaration that America could build not just heavy bombers and mass production giants, but something agile, elegant, and lethal. The little twin-engine bomber that no one wanted was now the hunter, and even the Bf-109s were learning to fear its shadow. As Rommel's forces retreated across Libya, Allied commanders began planning the next phase: Italy. and they knew the Havoc would lead the way. Its speed made it perfect for the mountains and valleys of southern Europe. Its precision meant fewer wasted bombs, and its reputation, the shock it brought to German columns, was now psychological as much as physical. In the brief quiet after one mission, Captain Chappell scribbled a note in his logbook. "The Luftwaffe called us crazy. Maybe we are, but they can't catch crazy." The A-20 Havoc had entered the war, and it wasn't leaving quietly.
By 1943, the A-20 Havoc had transformed from an underdog into one of the most versatile weapons in the Allied arsenal. What began as a tiny botter was now being reimagined, rebuilt, and reborn for a dozen roles across 3 continents. In the skies over Tunisia, Sicily, and the Mediterranean, it hunted by day. In the moonlit darkness above Italy and France, it hunted by night. The Havoc had become what every commander dreams of, a machine that could adapt faster than the enemy. When Allied forces landed in Sicily that summer, the Luftwaffe still held the night. German bombers harassed Allied convoys, slipped through the darkness to strike airfields, and disappeared before the defenses could react. Conventional fighters couldn't catch them. The British sent Mosquitoes, the Americans sent P-38s, and now the Americans also sent the A-20. Douglas engineers had been quietly working on something new: radar. Small, primitive, and fragile, it gave the Havoc eyes in the dark. The first night-fighting variants, A-20B Havoc II and later A-20J and K models, carried early airborne interception sets and extra guns in the nose. Their crews flew with red lights glowing on the instrument panels, radar scopes flickering like ghostly green suns. When the first of these aircraft took off from a dusty strip near Palermo, the pilots weren't sure what to expect. They'd trained for weeks to read their radar operators' voices, left 10 degrees, range decreasing, visual contact, and now they were about to try it against real German aircraft. That night, 2 A-20s intercepted a formation of Ju-88s over the coast. The radar operator whispered corrections as the pilot eased the throttle forward. Through the darkness, the black silhouettes of the bombers appeared, their exhausts glowing faint orange. The Havoc slid behind them like a predator. The pilot pressed the trigger, and the nose erupted with the flash of 4 50-caliber guns. 2 seconds later, one Ju-88 fell apart in mid-air. The others scattered. The American crews returned to base with a new nickname whispered on their radios: Night Reaper. But it wasn't just at night that the A-20 was rewriting the rules of air warfare. By day, the newer A-20G model had become one of the most formidable low-level attack aircraft in the world. The glass bombardier's nose was gone, replaced with solid aluminum packed with 6 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns. Each gun could spit out 800 rounds per minute. When all 6 fired together, the air around the plane seemed to vibrate. Pilots called it the buzzsaw. These A-20Gs didn't drop bombs from high altitude. They raced in at treetop level, strafing rail lines, convoys, and ships. When they dropped at bombs, they did it from 200 feet, turning the entire plane into a weapon of shock and speed. In Italy, crews from the 47th Bomb Group used the Havoc to slice through German supply routes like a scalpel. One day, they hit a train outside Naples loaded with ammunition. The explosion shook windows 20 miles away. Another time, a flight of 4 A-20s struck a bridge in Salerno and hit it dead center at 360 miles per hour. The bridge vanished, and the pilots were already over the sea before the dust settled. The Germans learned to dread the sound of twin Pratt & Whitney engines sweeping low over the hills. They began calling it Der Schwarze Blitz, the Black Lightning. In one intercepted letter, a German infantryman wrote home, "They come from the sun, drop fire, and are gone before you can pray." By late 1943, the A-20's reputation had spread beyond North Africa. In the Soviet Union, thousands of A-20s, delivered under the Lend-Lease program, flew under red stars on their wings. The Russians loved it. It was fast, simple, and rugged enough to handle the frozen airfields of the Eastern Front. They flew it as a bomber, a ground attack plane, even a torpedo carrier. At Kursk and Stalingrad, Soviet pilots used A-20s to destroy German armor concentrations before dawn. One crew, flying through a snowstorm at 200 feet, struck a column of panzers, then looped back and strafed the survivors until they ran out of ammunition. The gunner later wrote in his logbook, This is not an American bomber, it is a hammer. Back in the Mediterranean, the Havoc was becoming a legend among Allied pilots. Crews painted fierce nose art, snarling teeth, red eyes, cartoon devils, and flew missions from dusk till dawn. They began to take pride in the aircraft's name. Havoc was no longer a factory designation, it was a promise. In the night skies, the Raider Havocs hunted German bombers over the Adriatic. By day, the A-20Gs struck fuel depots and transport hubs. And when the Germans tried to retaliate, they often found that the same planes waiting for them in daylight would return after dark, unseen and unstoppable. The aircraft's duality, hunter by day, ghost by night, gave Allied commanders a rare gift: unpredictability. Yet for all its success, the Havoc's crews paid dearly. Night operations were dangerous beyond belief. One mistaken radar readings, one misjudged angle, and a plane could slam into a mountain in the dark. Engines overheated, icing blinded instruments. Sometimes the radar itself failed, and the pilot was left chasing a phantom blip through empty sky. In the daylight, flak was everywhere. The A-20s flew so low that shrapnel tore through their bellies. Crews came back with holes the size of fists in their wings. One pilot returned with his right engine burning and his landing gear half gone. He landed on his belly, slid to a stop, climbed out and said simply, "She didn't want to die yet." By the end of 1943, the Havoc had become more than just another airplane in the Allied arsenal. It had become a symbol of ingenuity, of what happened when raw speed met human adaptability. When the Luftwaffe tried to own the night, the Havoc lit it up with tracer fire. When the Germans hid their convoys in valleys, the Havoc found them. When the war demanded versatility, the A-20 delivered over deserts, seas, forests, and mountains. No other twin-engine aircraft in the war had served in so many roles in so many countries for so long. And it wasn't done yet. Because in 1944, the Havoc was about to teach the Luftwaffe one final lesson, that sometimes the best armor isn't steel, it's speed.
By 1944, the A-20 Havoc had become something far beyond the bomber that Douglas engineers first imagined. It was now a weapon of momentum, a machine that turned raw speed into survival and precision into destruction. The Luftwaffe, once certain that their fighters could dominate any twin-engine intruder, were beginning to learn the opposite. The A-20 was no longer a curiosity, it was a predator. The new A-20G and A-20H models rolled off American production lines with a kind of confidence that matched the men who flew them. The nose now bristled with 6 50-caliber machine guns, each one capable of spitting a stream of metal so dense it could cut a truck in half. The engines, twin Wright R2623 Cyclones, were tuned for higher output. At full throttle, with bomb racks empty and the wind behind it, the Havoc could touch 350 miles per hour. That number might not sound like much today, but in 1944, it was astonishing. Faster than many German Bf-109Gs and just behind the formidable FW-190A at sea level. For a bomber, it was heresy. When Luftwaffe pilots first encountered the new Havocs over Italy and southern France, they didn't believe what they were seeing. On March 4, 1944, a flight of 4 A-20Gs from the 416th Bomb Group streaked in low over a bridge near Avignon. German troops below barely had time to react before the bridge vanished in a fireball. As the planes climbed away, 2 Bf-109s dove to intercept. The German pilots expected an easy kill. Bombers had always been slow prey. But when they tried to close in, the Havocs opened their throttles. The twin Cyclones roared like unleashed beasts. The bombers began to pull away. The lead German fired a burst, missed, and radioed furiously, "They're faster than us! I can't catch them!" One of the American gunners looked back and later recalled, "We just watched them fade. It was like running from wolves who suddenly realized they were chasing cheetahs." The secret was not armor, but velocity. The A-20 had never been built to absorb punishment like a B-17 or Lancaster. Its protection was minimal, a few plates of armor around the cockpit and self-sealing fuel tanks. What kept it alive was its ability to hit and run before the enemy could react. Pilots learned to trust that instinct completely. One of them, Captain Ray Shute, described it best. "If you're still in sight after the bomb hits, you've stayed too long." That philosophy became gospel among A-20 crews.
They attacked in waves, low, fast, coordinated, crossing enemy lines at treetop height. The roar of their engines echoed through valleys before anti-aircraft crews even saw them. By the time the first flak bursts bloomed, the Havocs were already gone. Their favorite tactic was the skip bomb, dropping a bomb so low it would bounce off the ground or water, skipping into a target like a thrown stone. It was brutally effective against trains, bridges, and even ships. During one mission in Italy, an A-20 pilot from the 47th Group aimed a 500-pound bomb at a German freighter in Naples Harbor. The bomb skipped twice across the water and slammed into the ship's hull, detonating at the waterline. The vessel sank in minutes. When he returned, the pilot wrote in his logbook, "The old girl doesn't miss." As the war moved toward France, the Havoc's reputation grew. In the weeks before D-Day, A-20 squadrons launched hundreds of sorties against rail yards, ammunition dumps, and convoys. They flew so low that farmers later swore they could see the pilots' goggles. The French civilians called them les anges rapides, the swift angels. For the Germans, they were something else, the shadow of death at noon. In the chaos after the Normandy landings, A-20s flew in direct support of ground troops. They strafed German armor on the roads, dropped bombs on hedgerow fortifications, and blasted through columns of trucks retreating toward the Seine. The Luftwaffe tried to strike back, but their fighters were dwindling, short on fuel, short on pilots, short on everything. Those who still flew found that the A-20s were nearly impossible to catch. A German ace, Oberlieutenant Franz Reisinger of JG-26, admitted after the war, "The A-20 was not a bomber, it was a wasp. You hit one, another stung you, and they were gone before you could turn." In the summer of 1944, the 416th Bomb Group earned its nickname, the Flying Buzzsaws. Their attacks were relentless. On August 7th, near Chartres, 24 A-20s hit a German armored column moving to counter the Allied breakout. They came in at less than 200 feet, guns blazing. The first wave destroyed the lead tanks, the second wave shredded the rear. When the smoke cleared, 80 vehicles burned on the roadside. Not a single A-20 was lost. Commanders couldn't believe the reports. They ordered reconnaissance flights to confirm. The photos showed miles of wreckage and the tracks of 4 A-20s still visible across the fields, vanishing into the horizon. But the Havoc's greatest weapon wasn't in its guns or engines. It was in the people who flew it. Pilots and gunners were young, restless, and fiercely proud of their aircraft. They painted shark mouths, lightning bolts, and names like Bad Medicine, Satan's Sister, and Hell's Angel on their noses. They flew low enough to make trees bend in their wake. They had a saying, "If you can read the road signs, you're flying the right altitude." And they meant it. The Luftwaffe began to avoid open engagement with A-20 formations. Their fighters, already overtasked, couldn't afford the risk. Instead, German commanders concentrated their defenses on flak. But even that was too slow. The A-20 struck too fast to stop. By the autumn of 1944, as Allied forces pushed across France, the A-20 had become a legend. It was no longer the little bomber or the twin-engine target. It was a phantom that blurred the line between bomber and fighter, strategy and instinct. In a letter home, one gunner summed it up better than any official report ever could. "They laughed at our plane when we got it, said it looked like a toy. But I've seen Messerschmitts try to catch us, and I've watched them fall behind. This toy kills fast." As winter fell over Europe, the A-20's engine still thundered over the snow. It had survived flak, fighters, and the skepticism of generals. Its skin was dented, its wings patched, its crews exhausted, but it was still flying, still fighting, still outrunning everything that tried to stop it. And soon, as the Allies crossed the Rhine, the Havoc would complete its transformation, from underestimated experiment to symbol of Allied ingenuity. For in the end, the A-20's greatest armor was not its metal, nor its guns, but the one truth every pilot learned to trust. Speed keeps you alive.
By the time the war neared its end in 1945, the A-20 Havoc had flown across nearly every theater of World War II, from the deserts of North Africa to the frozen steppe of Russia, from the mountains of Italy to the hedgerows of France and the jungles of the Pacific. Wherever it went, it brought the same thing: speed, precision, and an unnerving sense of inevitability. For an aircraft that nobody wanted, the Havoc had become indispensable. When the Allies crossed into Germany in early 1945, 820s from the 416th, 409th, and 47th Bomb Groups were flying daily sorties over railways, bridges, and retreating convoys. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of the skies, was now a shadow of itself. Short on fuel and pilots, it could barely mount resistance. For A-20 crews, the war was almost unrecognizable. Missions that had once been desperate struggles against Bf-109s and FW-190s now often went unopposed. What danger remained came from the ground: flak batteries hidden in forests, machine guns bristling from rooftops. But the Havoc was in its element. It darted through river valleys, hugged the tree line, and struck with mechanical precision. In those final months, the aircraft wasn't just winning battles, it was ending them. In April 1945, over the shattered bridges of the Ruhr, an A-20 named Miscarriage became the last Havoc of the European theater to score a confirmed aerial kill, shooting down an FW-190 that had tried to intercept the formation. The German fighter couldn't close the distance before a burst from the Havoc's nose guns shredded it mid-air. When the crew landed, their squadron commander laughed and said, "You boys just made history. A bomber outflew a fighter again." That single moment summed up everything the A-20 had stood for. By VE Day, more than 7,400 A-20s had been built. They'd served under the flags of 5 nations: the United States, Britain, Australia, the Soviet Union, and the Free French. The Soviets alone flew nearly 3,000 of them under Lend-Lease, calling it Boston or Douglas. In the East, they were used as night bombers, tank killers, and even torpedo planes along the Baltic coast. A Russian pilot later said, "The A-20 was like a wolf. It could live anywhere, fight anything, and come home with blood on its teeth." In the Pacific, Havocs pounded Japanese airfields and shipping lanes from New Guinea to the Philippines. Their speed made them perfect for hit-and-run raids over island strongholds, darting between clouds and anti-aircraft fire. Even there, in a theater dominated by the mighty B-25 Mitchell and the heavy B-24 Liberator, the A-20 earned respect as the little plane that always came back. When the war finally ended, the Havoc's role was finished. Jet engines were already rewriting aviation's future. The world that the A-20 had conquered of piston engines, low-level bombing, and speed as armor was giving way to a new generation of machines that would climb faster and fly higher than ever before. But its influence didn't vanish, it evolved. From the A-20's sleek design and twin-engine layout came the Douglas A-26 Invader, a direct descendant and spiritual successor. The Invader would go on to fight in Korea and even Vietnam, long after the Havoc had been retired. Later still, its design philosophy, speed, survivability, and concentrated forward firepower would echo in aircraft like the A-10 Thunderbolt II, built not to escape the enemy, but to strike fast and survive the return fire. In the decades that followed, many A-20s were scrapped, melted down into peacetime metal. But a few survived, scattered across museums from the United States to Australia, from Britain to Russia. At the Smithsonian's Udvar Hasse Center, a fully restored A-20G stands under the hangar lights, its olive-drab skin gleaming, nose art still visible, little hellion. Its propellers rest still now, but the placard beneath it tells the real story. This aircraft flew 113 combat missions over Europe. None of its crews were lost. Visitors stop and read the inscription and realize what the statistics never quite capture, that this small 2-engine plane changed how pilots thought about survival. It didn't win by being the biggest. It didn't win by being the most powerful. It won by being faster than death itself. In interviews after the war, German pilots often spoke of the shock the A-20 gave them. One recalled, "We would dive on it expecting to kill it in one pass. Instead, it disappeared, climbing away, turning faster than a bomber should. It defied what we knew." Even Erich Hartmann, the Luftwaffe's top ace, once commented, "The Americans made their bombers fly like fighters, and that was the hardest thing to fight." The Havoc had done more than outrun German fighters. It had outrun the very idea of what a bomber could be. For the men who flew it, the A-20 remained personal.
Pilots still gather in veterans' reunions, their jackets embroidered with the silhouette of the twin-tail bomber that saved their lives. They speak of its quirks with affection, the way it vibrated under full throttle, the way the cockpit smelled of oil and cordite, and the way it leapt into the air as if eager to fight. At one reunion, an aging pilot raised his glass and said, "We called her Havoc, but she was more than that. She was hope with engines." Today, when you stand beside one of those surviving Havocs, its aluminum skin cold, its guns silent, it's easy to forget that this once was the fastest bomber in the sky. But if you close your eyes, you can almost hear it. The growl of twin cyclones, the rush of wind over the nose, the heartbeat of the crew as they skimmed just above the desert or the trees. And if you listen closely, you might also hear the echo of the laughter that once greeted it, the German pilots who called it a toy, a slow twin-engine target. Because when the Havoc answered that laughter, it did so with a roar that tore through the skies of North Africa and Europe faster than any fighter expected. And in doing so, it earned its name. A-20 Havoc. She didn't promise destruction, she delivered it.